To another episode of the Miss Myers Show. I hope you all had a fabulous Thanksgiving and ate all that yummy food. I know I did as well. And I went shopping on Black Friday and braved the crowds and saved a ton of money. So I'm ready to get back to work. So I know you guys are too, right? So what we're going to talk about, continuing to talk about today, is Reconstruction. Last time we met, we talked about, the Civil War was over. Lincoln had wanted to put into a plan to readmit the southern states because they had, broken away from the Union. And that process is called Reconstruction. Well, Lincoln really wasn't very harsh on the southern states. He felt a lot of them really had no choice in the matter and they just kind of did what they were told. He treated them more or less like bad kids who weren't listening to their parents and kind of being naughty and, needed to be punished. And things like that. So when Lincoln died, he basically the whole plan of Reconstruction kind of changed. With Lincoln dying, Andrew Johnson became the president. And Johnson's plan for Reconstruction was very, very similar to Abraham Lincoln's plan.
For the first 48 days of Andrew Johnson's presidency, Southerners waited anxiously to hear what he would demand before allowing them back into the Union. On May 29, 1865, Johnson announced his plan for what would be called Presidential Reconstruction.
There was good evidence in 1865 that a lot of white Southerners, leadership even of the Confederacy, would have accepted relatively harsh policies at that moment. But very soon it became clear that Andrew Johnson wanted a rapid, lenient restoration of the Union with as little alteration of the Constitution and the creation of black civil and political rights as possible.
Johnson would issue blanket pardons for most former Confederates. The rebel states would be encouraged to form new governments quickly. Washington would not interfere. The president's leniency surprised many in the North. Southerners responded with relief.
Johnson actually sets only the most minimal requirements. All they have to do is admit we lost the Civil War. The Civil War is over, slavery and secession are dead. Other than that, there are no requirements.
Johnson was harder on the planter aristocracy. He insisted that wealthy planters and Confederate leaders write him personally and beg for clemency.
This basically eliminates the planter class from leadership of Southern politics. If you're not pardoned, you can't vote, you can't hold office, and you can't get your property back if it's been seized by the federal government.
Andrew Johnson had no sympathy for wealthy planters. He had risen from poverty and identified with poor white Southerners who, before the war, had far outnumbered the slave owners. Now, he was anxious to protect poor whites from what they saw as a new threat.
Poor whites have to face the fact that now that black people are free means that they have to compete with this new element for livelihoods, for social positions, and for political power, ultimately. And this is a very frightening thing.
Johnson's aim is to bring the white South and the white North back together. African Americans just do not play a role in Johnson's vision of the post-war South other than to go back to work and be landless and rightless plantation laborers.
Johnson's contempt for the freedmen infuriated many in Washington. and none more than Thaddeus Stevens. The congressman from Pennsylvania had been a fierce abolitionist long before the war. Within the Republican Party, he led a small, vocal faction known as the Radicals.
These were principled men. Before the war, they had been the strongest Republicans opposing the expansion of slavery. During the Civil War, they had been the first ones to call for arming of black troops, for issuing an emancipation proclamation. Long before there was any conceivable political benefit to be gained from supporting the rights of black people, they were doing it.
The radical Republicans had a vision of what Reconstruction should be. They believed it should be longer in duration. They believed the Southern states had left the Union and had destroyed their status as states. They had to be reinvented. To Thaddeus Stevens, Reconstruction meant not only safeguarding and preserving the essential results of the Civil War, but in his vision, it meant remaking the South. It meant the increase of democracy in terms of representation. It meant the spread of the right of suffrage.
The Radicals' hard line marginalized them within their own party. Most Republicans feared the Radicals' position on black rights would drive away white voters in the North.
It is the radical wing which is the most sympathetic to black people. The party in general was committed to a limited program of civil rights, protection of property, education, etc. But the party is not in any way committed to any sort of radical restructuring of Southern society.
Johnson's Reconstruction plan could not be challenged until Congress convened in December. That summer, radical leaders could only watch as scores of planters descended on Washington, pleading to be pardoned. Whose petition would be denied or granted was uncertain. Still, former Confederates were hopeful. White men alone, President Johnson told one senator, must manage the South.
Johnson also really didn't treat these southern states very harshly. He kind of felt like Lincoln did that, a lot of the people in the South kind of just went with the flow. The majority of Southerners were not these big slave owners. They were pretty much your poor farmers. So when the southern states seceded from the Union and formed their own country, a lot of the people just kind of did what they had to do and, went with them. So Johnson didn't want to punish them too much. I swear something fell and hit me. All right. So, okay, these things are flying into the room. This is coming at me. So I'm assuming that that's why someone... Oh! You hit me in the mouth! I was abused. They just came and shot me right in the lip. That's it. Okay. So Johnson's plan was, very, like I said, very similar to Lincoln's in the fact that they wanted to, kind of be easier on these southern states. Well, the radical Republicans, who were a different group than what Johnson and Lincoln were a part of, they didn't think that this was a very good idea. They thought that Lincoln's plan and Johnson's plan was way too easy on these southern states, because really all Johnson in his plan had said, in order to be readmitted into the Union, you would have to repeal the secession ordinance. You would have to repudiate the Confederate debt, meaning you had to pay for the war, and you had to ratify the 13th Amendment, and the 13th Amendment abolished slavery. So once you did all of those things, you could be readmitted into the Union. And the radical Republicans thought this was way too easy, because what was stopping these southern states from saying, okay, yeah, we do all that, but then go back home and still act and be the same way they were before the Civil War. So that's why they were really kind of angry with this whole issue of how Johnson was going about it. One thing that went into place, especially in the South, was something called the Black Codes. Now, even though, and this is why the radical Republicans were kind of right, even though this war was over and the 13th Amendment abolishing slavery was put into place, Southern states put something called Black Codes into place. And what this was, it was an attempt to control the freedmen, and the freedmen are the freed slaves. So now, even though these former slaves are free and they have a right to vote and they can own property and things like that, a lot of southern states, including Louisiana, put into place these black codes that said, basically, it was kind of like a slavery, putting them right back into slavery. They, it said that they had to work. God, get out! I'm being ambushed by a Nerf gun. Jeez, all right. Where was I? Okay. Yes, the black codes were put into place to kind of, it was kind of like slavery, basically. It told, it basically told, the freedmen they had to sign contracts to work on plantations because they weren't slaves, anymore, but they would, they needed a job. Here are these slaves. They are now free people. So now they need to assimilate into society. They need to find work. They need to get a place to live. They need, basic necessities. So they're kind of like, what do we do now? They're all of a sudden these free people. Well, these plantation owners were telling these freed slaves, well, come on, come back here and you can work for me and you won't be a slave, you'll be an employee. Well, that sounded like a good thing to a lot of these freed slaves. So they would sign a contract saying that they would work on the plantation for an X amount of years and they would be given room and board, they'd be given their meals and things like that. Well, that all sounded, really good, but in all actuality, it was basically just slavery. They signed these contracts saying that they would work on their plantations for numbers of years, but the plantation owners would always find some way to keep them working longer. They would say, oh, well, you need to pay for,
Almost immediately, most former rebel states enact harsh laws known as Black Codes.
The Black Codes are laws designed to regulate the lives of blacks, in particular to control their movements throughout the South and to force them back onto the plantations as farm laborers working for the white landlords.
Some codes prohibit blacks from owning firearms, buying liquor, or engaging in any trade or business other than farming. The land promised to the freedmen is returned to unrepentant rebels, sentencing blacks to a landless existence for generations to come. Often, white landowners would hire freed slaves to work the harvest, only to chase them off the land when their wages came due. Unable to collect their meager earnings, many blacks starved to death.
Johnson looked the other way as these ex-Confederate governments reimposed stringent controls over the black race through the Black Codes, which were a de facto form of slavery in that they regulated the daily lives of blacks, much like apartheid in South Africa.
Some states go so far as to legalize the beatings of former slaves who are considered to have misbehaved.
Beating black people who step out of line for, things such as not getting off the sidewalk when you see a white man or white woman walking by. So small infractions are things that can be perceived as shucking that Southern way of life, so to speak.
This, or you need to pay for that, so you need to work for me even longer. And it was basically just like slavery, putting them into this this circle. The governor of Louisiana at this time was a man named Wells, and he played both sides, basically. In Louisiana, after the Civil War, you had two types of people. You had your radical Republicans, and then you had your Democrats. Now, your radical Republicans were more or less wanting to, were more or less trying to help the freedmen, wanted to give the freedmen more rights. Most of the radical Republicans in Louisiana were not even from the South, let alone Louisiana. And then you had your Democrats, which were the majority of them were your ex-Confederate soldiers and Confederate members like that. So those are your two people. Now, Governor Wells here in Louisiana, he didn't know which side to stand on. He wanted to play both sides because he didn't want to make one side, very angry at him. So while he was a supporter of the Union, he also did not agree that freedmen should have the same rights as, the white people of Louisiana. So he was really in the middle. He didn't go with either side of radical Republicans or Democrats. He did things that angered Republicans. He did things that angered the Democrats. He could never pick a side. He tried to, as time went on, and as in Louisiana, he saw that more and more radical Republicans were gaining power after the Civil War. He tried to kind of go and be on their team, but it was too late. There was nothing that he could do to save his reputation at that point. Now, the Louisiana Republicans, after the Civil War, were really trying to gain power and were having a lot of trouble doing that. In Louisiana, remember, we were one of the first states to, sign all of the secession things for Abraham Lincoln. So we were one of the first ones to get kind of back into the Union. And when we did that, the people who were in charge right after the Civil War were just the same people who were in charge before the Civil War. And that was still going on. So you had radical Republicans here in Louisiana that were trying to gain power. Well, they started to say, you know what? This isn't right, because we have, we as radical Republicans want to allow the freedmen more let them vote and give them property. We're here to help them. Well, in Louisiana, the majority of people were ex-slaves. So the radical Republicans said, it doesn't make sense that we're losing elections when the majority of people who live in this state are former slaves. So what they did is, during elections and when people started to go up and run for office, they saw that a lot of these freedmen were being prohibited to vote by the black codes. They were not able to cast their vote. And if they were casting their vote, they were bullied into making a vote for a Democrat. So once the radical Republicans saw that this was happening, they made it so that when it was time for elections, there was a radical Republican on the ballot, and the freedmen were not only allowed to vote, but allowed to vote for someone who they would want to win. Once that happens, we start to see more and more radical Republicans be in control and in charge of Louisiana and the South in general. So now radical Reconstruction is beginning. By 1867, Johnson had lost most of his support, and the radical Republicans were saying that this guy is just way too easy. So what they passed was the Military Reconstruction Act, and this divided the South into military districts and put someone in charge of districts to make sure that things were, progressing the way that they wanted to. Now, Louisiana and Texas were divided into one district, and they were overseen by a man by the name of General Philip Sheridan. Now, when he got here as the military commander of Louisiana and Texas, he got rid of Governor Wells because, well, Wells didn't know where he was, what he was doing, really. He got rid of the chief of police of New Orleans, and he got rid of the mayor of New Orleans because he believed that they were very corrupt, which they probably were. He replaced each person with a strong radical Republican in office. Now, who he replaced Wells with was a guy by the name of Governor Benjamin Flanders. Doesn't that sound like Flanders? Isn't that like from The Simpsons? Ned Flanders? And what Flanders was, a very, very much radical Republican. He was a native New Orleanian, and he was a Union supporter. He really didn't even care. When Louisiana was breaking away and joining the Confederacy, Flanders flew an American flag outside of his house, which was scandalous. He ran away, when things got really heated here in Louisiana, and he finally came back after the war was over. So he was the first choice for the governor. He supported the freedmen's voting rights. He opposed the black codes. He wanted to help the former slaves really assimilate into modern society at that time. So he wanted really to change things in Louisiana. And things were going really well until Sheridan was replaced. And his replacement was a man by the name of Winfield Scott. Now, Winfield Scott Hancock. Now, he was much more along the lines of what Johnson wanted. He was not like Flanders in how he wanted to help the freedmen and things like that. He wanted Reconstruction to be as quick and as painless as possible. So he started removing some of these radical Republicans that were put into office by Sheridan and replacing them with Democrats. And the Democrats at that time, they did not want, the freedmen to have the opportunity to vote or to have any equality. They didn't agree with that. So Flanders got so upset. He was so angry about what happened. He resigned. He said, I'm leaving. I'm quitting. I'm going away. I'm not dealing with this anymore. He resigned after only 7 months. Now, Flanders was replaced by Governor Baker, and Baker was much more of what Johnson wanted. He was a moderate Democrat. He did not agree with racial equality. He did not want to help the freedmen. He was just not what Flanders and Sheridan were all about. I see the door opening. Stop! Don't shoot me anymore. You'll hurt me. Close the door. Yeah, okay. Now, corruption.
You're fired.
Okay, the last thing that we're going to talk about is the corruption in Louisiana when it started during radical Reconstruction. Now, remember how I had said before that the radical Reconstructionists were now making it so that the freedmen could vote in elections. So now we have all the radical Republicans that are making sure that these freedmen are able to cast their votes for a candidate that will assist them and will speak on their behalf. And they, there's more freedmen in Louisiana at this point than there were ex-Confederate soldiers. So they elected, the majority of Louisiana, elected a man by the name of Henry Clay Warmoth. Now Henry Clay Warmoth was one of the youngest governors that Louisiana had ever had. He was only 26, so that's really young. And it seemed that Warmoth was going to do a great job. He said he was going to help the freedmen. He was going to get Louisiana economy back and running. He was going to, get us in. He was just said he was going to do all kind of good things. He wasn't even from Louisiana. He was originally from Illinois. He came here after the Civil War. So he was one of those carpetbaggers, who came here after the Civil War. Now, Warmoth was not what he said he was. He was very, very, very corrupt. He took bribes for things like that. He owned a newspaper, and he made it so that all of the government printing in Louisiana was done using his newspaper, and was able to make $1 million a year during this time, and this is in the 1860s. So his salary was only $8,000. That's what he was supposed to make. That's what was his given salary by the state of Louisiana. But he banked $1 million in newspaper contracts. So because he ran, the state, he was the state of Louisiana governor, he made it so that if any government thing needed to be printed, they would only use his newspaper, which is totally illegal. Totally. He spent more than $1 million on personal items. This is in 1860s. He just was super corrupt. He gave jobs to his friends, things like that. One of the things that he did was he would, if someone was hired on to work for him, they would have to sign a letter of resignation on day one. And that's basically saying a letter saying that you quit. And what Warmoth would do is he would take that letter and file it away. And when he got mad at you because you did something he didn't like, he would take out that letter, he'd date it and sign it and say, oh, look, you resigned, goodbye, which was, again, totally illegal. He even set up an open bar at the basement of the Capitol building. I mean, he did things that were totally, totally scandalous. So he was not, this is what really starts this whole, thing of corruption in Louisiana politics. I mean, we have been corrupt, really, in politics. I mean, starting with Bienville and Iberville, we're having lots of corruption. But this is where it starts to become really common knowledge to all of the other, people in Louisiana. Now, what's cool that happened during the same election that put Warmoth into, the governor's office, voters, ratified a new constitution. And I wanted to see. Yes. Okay. Yeah. All right. Just making sure with my dates because I can get mixed up with all of these dates. So they ratified this new constitution, and a lieutenant governor was chosen. Okay, just want to make sure. And lieutenant governor at this time was a man by the name of Oscar J. Dunn. And what was really cool about Dunn is that he was a former slave, and he became the first African American in Louisiana to be elected into political office. So that's awesome. This is right after the Civil War. This was a former slave who was born into slavery, is now an elected official in the state of Louisiana. So that is really pretty cool. So we had some awesome things going on in politics at this time. We had some really terrible things going on in politics this time. But Louisiana is trying to get their footing, and we're trying to be readmitted into the United States. At this time that we're talking about right now, Louisiana is still a military district. Even though they were allowed to, they did everything that Lincoln had required them to do, it's now gone with the Military Reconstruction Act. And they are now under the control of a military district. So until Louisiana makes certain gains, they will remain under the control of a military leader. And then after that is over and these gains have been made, they will be allowed to re-enter the Union and have senators and congressmen and things like that. At this point, during what we're talking about, Louisiana has none of that. They're not even considered to be a state. They are a military district. So that's what we're going to talk about next time, is Louisiana continuing to make the effort to move forward into a state after Reconstruction. So that's all I've got for you guys today, and I will see you soon. Look at this. I see you!